Hello everyone and welcome to my Sister Wives For You channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. So awkward it hurt to watch is the only way fans can describe the painfully tense, emotionally charged, and brutally revealing showdown between Robyn Brown and Janelle Brown that unfolded like a slow-motion emotional car crash on Sister Wives, a moment that didn't just expose the cracks in the Brown family, but completely demolished any remaining illusions that unity was still possible, because what began as a stiff, overly polite conversation quickly spiraled into a devastating emotional standoff packed with passive-aggressive jabs, bitter truths, simmering resentment, and years of unspoken hostility finally erupting into the open. And from the moment Janelle sat down across from Robyn with that unmistakable look of emotional exhaustion mixed with quiet fury, viewers could feel that something was about to snap, especially as Robyn launched into her trademark wounded confusion routine, questioning why the family had fallen apart, as if she were merely a helpless bystander, rather than the central figure many fans believe played a decisive role in the breakdown. And Janelle's reaction to that question said everything without saying a word as she hesitated, inhaled deeply, and then unleashed a carefully controlled but emotionally loaded response that cut straight through the performative innocence Robyn so often clings to, reminding her that abandonment, favoritism, and broken trust don't just materialize out of thin air. And that was when the awkwardness truly began to suffocate the scene, because Robyn visibly stiffened as if she hadn't expected Janelle to push back so directly, her eyes darting nervously, her hands fidgeting, her voice trembling between self-pity and defensiveness, while Janelle, usually the most pragmatic and emotionally restrained of the wives, finally allowed herself to speak what fans have suspected for years: that the emotional imbalance in the family wasn't accidental, but the consequence of repeated choices that always seemed to benefit Robyn and isolate everyone else. And the energy in that moment became so thick with tension that viewers could practically feel the discomfort leaking through their screens as Robyn attempted to redirect the conversation toward her own pain, insisting she had tried so hard and had been misunderstood, only for Janelle to quietly but devastatingly point out that trying hard means very little when the outcomes consistently hurt the same people over and over again. And that was the instant when the showdown shifted from awkward to outright humiliating, because Robyn's carefully constructed victim narrative began to unravel under the weight of Janelle's calm but relentless logic, exposing the emotional double standards that have haunted the family for over a decade. And while Robyn dabbed at dry eyes and whispered about how lonely she feels as Cody's only remaining wife, Janelle countered with the reality that loneliness doesn't excuse dismantling relationships one by one, especially when financial control, emotional manipulation, and selective loyalty have left the rest of the family fractured beyond recognition. And the body language alone was devastating to watch as Robyn leaned back defensively with arms crossed while Janelle leaned forward, ground steady, voice unwavering, no longer willing to shrink herself to protect Robyn's feelings. And fans couldn't help but notice that Cody's absence from the confrontation made everything even more revealing, because for the first time Robyn was forced to confront the emotional wreckage without hiding behind her husband's rage, deflection, or intimidation. And the result was painfully raw as Robyn struggled to explain why she ended up with the legal marriage, the mansion, the nanny, and the lion's share of Cody's time, while the other wives were left scrambling emotionally and financially. And when Janelle brought up the land at Coyote Pass and the lingering question of fairness and broken financial promises, the tension skyrocketed as Robyn's voice cracked with indignation, insisting that she never wanted more than anyone else, a claim that landed with all the believability of a poorly rehearsed alibi, especially as Janelle quietly reminded her that intentions mean nothing when outcomes paint a very different picture. And fans across social media exploded in real time as this exchange unfolded, calling it one of the most uncomfortable moments in the show's history, because it laid bare what had always lingered beneath the surface: that Robyn's emotional narrative and Janelle's lived reality simply cannot coexist without contradiction. And the shameful undertone of the showdown came not from screaming or name-calling, but from the hollow pauses, the trembling denials, the forced smiles, and the uncomfortable silence that followed each emotionally loaded truth bomb. And it was in one of those silences that Janelle delivered perhaps the most quietly devastating line of all, when she admitted that she no longer believes reconciliation is possible because trust, once shattered this deeply, can't simply be glued back together with apologies that never quite take responsibility. And Robyn's reaction to that statement was especially telling, because instead of acknowledging the pain Janelle described, she retreated inward, whispering that she feels blamed for everything. A deflection that only reinforced Janelle's point that accountability remains the missing piece in every attempt at healing, and the viewer could almost feel secondhand embarrassment as Robyn struggled to hold her composure under the weight of years of unspoken accusations finally being said aloud. And what made the scene even more unbearable to watch was the underlying reality that this showdown wasn't just about two women clashing, but about the irreversible collapse of a family that once prided itself on unity, cooperation, and shared purpose. And as the conversation dragged on with neither woman truly yielding, the emotional gulf between them became impossible to ignore, because where Janelle spoke from a place of exhausted acceptance, Robyn responded from a place of wounded entitlement, still searching for validation instead of resolution. And it was that emotional disconnect that made the moment feel so shameful, because it highlighted how completely out of sync their realities have become. And when the cameras finally pulled away, leaving the conversation unresolved and painfully suspended in emotional limbo, viewers were left with the unmistakable sense that this was not a turning point toward reconciliation, but a final fracture, confirming that the Brown family as it once existed is truly beyond saving. And in the aftermath, fans dissected every glance, every pause, every clipped sentence, concluding that the showdown didn't just expose tension between two former sister wives, but confirmed what many had long suspected, that Robyn's rise to emotional dominance within the family came at a devastating cost, and Janelle's quiet retreat from the marriage, built on years of independence and quiet endurance, now stands as one of the clearest rejections of that dynamic, making the entire scene feel like a symbolic passing of the torch, where the old rules of silence and emotional suppression were finally abandoned in favor of painful honesty. And what made the aftermath of that painfully awkward confrontation even more unsettling was the way the emotional shockwaves rippled outward across the entire Sister Wives universe, because even though the exchange itself was quiet, restrained, and almost surgically polite in its delivery, the implications were thunderous, as fans immediately understood that Janelle's calm refusal to validate Robyn's victim narrative marked a decisive emotional break that had been building for years beneath the surface of polite smiles and forced family gatherings. And as social media erupted with frame-by-frame dissections of every glance and micro-expression, viewers began pointing out details that made the scene even more devastating in hindsight, like the way Robyn repeatedly avoided direct eye contact whenever accountability came up, or how her voice wavered only when the conversation veered toward finances and fairness rather than emotional connection, reinforcing the long-held suspicion that power, security, and control have always mattered more to her than the so-called family unity she claims to grieve, while Janelle, on the other hand, exhibited a striking emotional clarity that stunned longtime fans who had previously labeled her as detached or emotionally reserved, because what became obvious in that moment was not emotional distance, but emotional containment, the kind that only forms after years of swallowing frustration for the sake of stability, children, and survival. And when that containment finally cracked in Robyn's presence, it wasn't explosive but surgical, each word chosen with precision, each statement delivered with the calm certainty of someone who no longer needs permission to speak the truth. And it was that quiet authority that seemed to unnerve Robyn the most, because for once, she wasn't facing a woman who needed family approval or feared rocking the boat. She was facing someone who had already emotionally exited, and therefore had nothing left to lose. And the imbalance in their emotional positions became almost cruelly evident as Robyn continued to frame herself as confused, abandoned, and misunderstood, while Janelle articulated systemic patterns of favoritism, exclusion, and emotional inequity that stretched all the way back to the early years of Robyn's entrance into the family. forcing viewers to confront the uncomfortable realization that what Robyn perceives as rejection may simply be the delayed consequence of long-standing behavior that was never properly addressed. And perhaps the most unsettling element of the entire showdown was how both women were technically telling the truth, just not the same truth, because Robyn truly does feel isolated now, abandoned in a family she once hoped to dominate emotionally, while Janelle truthfully feels betrayed by a system that repeatedly rewarded loyalty with neglect and independence with punishment. And when those two truths collided in that awkward, suspended emotional space, there was no resolution possible, only exposure, and fans who once clung to the idea that reconciliation might still happen were forced to abandon that hope as the conversation drifted further from mutual understanding and closer to a reconcilable reality. And what added another layer of secondhand discomfort was the presence of the cameras themselves, quietly capturing every strained breath and clipped sentence, turning a deeply personal emotional reckoning into public spectacle. And it was impossible to ignore how differently each woman performed under that spotlight, with Robyn slipping into familiar patterns of soft crying, trembling voice, and wounded innocence, while Janelle remained steady, grounded, and unperformative, speaking not for sympathy, but for closure. And in doing so, redefining herself not as the easygoing background wife she had been framed as for so many seasons, but as the emotional backbone who had long held the family's logistics, finances, and stability together while receiving little gratitude in return. And as fans revisited past episodes with renewed clarity, moments that once seemed trivial suddenly took on new meaning, from the repeated family relocations that disproportionately burdened Janelle to the financial entanglements that placed her investments at risk while Robyn's security remained untouched. All of it forming a mosaic of inequality that now made her calm confrontation feel not only justified but inevitable. And when Robyn insisted once again that she never asked to be the favorite, fans recoiled at the implication because favoritism, as Janelle subtly emphasized, doesn't require a request when it's consistently accepted without protest, and that single unspoken truth hung in the air like an accusation too heavy for either woman to fully name. And the emotional weight of that realization may be what ultimately made the scene feel so shameful to watch, not because one woman triumphed over the other, but because both were finally forced to face the version of themselves that had been mirrored back by years of unresolved conflict. And perhaps what hurt the most for longtime viewers was recognizing that this showdown represented the end of the original Sister Wives dream itself, the collapse of the once marketed ideal of cooperation, shared motherhood, and collective resilience, replaced now with legal marriages, isolated households, fractured finances, and emotional silos that no amount of nostalgia can repair. And in the days following the episode, fan commentary grew increasingly divided as some sympathized with Robyn's visible distress, while others argued that visible pain does not erase invisible harm, and Janelle's steady demeanor quickly became a rallying symbol for viewers who saw in her the embodiment of delayed justice, not through revenge or humiliation, but through quiet withdrawal and emotional self-preservation. And the cruel irony of it all is that Robyn now experiences the very isolation she once denied was happening to others, yet her inability to recognize the symmetry of that suffering only deepens the divide, and what once might have been an opportunity for mutual recognition instead became further proof that these two women now live in separate emotional realities shaped by radically different outcomes of the same family story. And even Cody's shadow loomed heavily over the entire exchange despite his physical absence, because every unresolved grievance, every financial question, every emotional fracture ultimately traced back to his choices, his favoritism, his shifting narratives of loyalty and respect. And yet, in this moment, he remained conspicuously absent, leaving Robyn exposed without her usual shield and forcing Janelle to finally speak without fear of retaliation. And that absence may be what gave the confrontation its quiet power, because it stripped away the distraction of his outbursts and allowed the raw emotional consequences of his leadership to stand unfiltered between the two women most affected by its imbalance. And as the season continues to unfold, fans are already speculating that this awkward showdown will be remembered not as a dramatic peak, but as an emotional endpoint, The moment when the last fragile thread connecting Robyn and Janelle finally snapped without spectacle or screaming, only exhaustion, truth, and resignation. And the haunting stillness that followed their exchange felt less like unresolved tension, and more like a mutual, unspoken acknowledgement that whatever existed between them as sister wives has now permanently transformed into something distant.